In today's video, I'm going to show you how to nest one component in Cwicly inside of another component. So this is what we're going to achieve by the end of today's video. So I have a component here, and this is my pros and cons component. This is the parent component. If we go over here to modifier, inside of there, you can see there's a div that wraps it all. We have a heading that says pros and cons. Then we have a paragraph here, which if we open up the Cwicly block inspector, we can see that there's a property here. And then inside there, we have an inner blocks block. And then inside of that, we have some components. So this is a component here for pros and cons. And then up here is the parent component. Now, I'm also going to show you how to set up in this video the ability to style a component. So here, this is a pro and con, and over here, we can change whether it's a pro or a con by selecting over here. So if I wanted to change this to a con, I would click that, and the background color changes to a red. If we go up, it changes to the green. So that's two things you're going to know how to do by the end of today's video: how to create a style for your component that alters its appearance using a drop down here, and then also how to nest that component inside of another component. The third and final thing that I'm going to show you how to do in today's video is the following. If we exit out of that and we go over to here for components and we click to insert our pros and cons component, you can see our component gets inserted, and then we have our pros and cons, header, paragraph, inner blocks, but the inner blocks comes empty by default. And so what that means is if we insert that component into there, our nested components are removed. And I explain why that happens towards the end of today's video. But to get around that, we will be creating a local pattern. So instead of inserting the parent component here, what we're actually going to do is, if I exit out of that, is the following. When I'm going and writing a blog post, I would go up to here, and then I would go to patterns, and then to my patterns, and then there's my pros and cons pattern. And if I click to insert that, now that's added into my blog post. We have the parent component there. And then inside of the inner blocks, we have those nested components there for the pro and cons component. But more on why we need to use a local pattern a little bit later on. So if that sounds like something that you're interested in learning how it works and how you can use this in your website, or just how Cwicly is implementing this within their builder, then definitely stick around and watch this video, and let's get into it. Here on my screen is my most recent video released about 2 weeks ago, where we converted some advanced custom fields blocks over to Cwicly components. Today's video will be building upon the components that we built in that video. So if you want to learn how to create components from scratch, I would definitely recommend going and watching this video. I will link to it in the description below. If we click into this video, down here Sunny from New Pulse Labs said, for your pros and cons blocks, you could consolidate it into one component using styles. So we are going to do that in today's video. And then he also made the suggestion that we could try and put our pros and cons component into a wrapper component, and then add an inner blocks element inside there with some pros and cons there. So that is what we're doing in today's video. So let's go ahead and do that. And in doing this, you'll be able to see not only creating a component with style options, but then also we're going to go ahead and create a nested component, which is basically what this is saying there. And before filming this video, I did try and do this, and it does work. So definitely thank you, Sunny, for explaining that. I hadn't actually tried the inner blocks block, and I hadn't tried adding a style option to components. So I learned a lot in doing what we're about to do in today's video as well. So here I have a blank post, and to add components inside it Cwicly, over here we have our menu. There's components, and if I open that up, you can see 3 components here, and these are the ones that we created in that previous video from scratch. So again, definitely go and watch that video if you want to see how to set these up. So when I'm going and writing a blog post and I'm doing a review on a plugin, I would click to add a pro. And then here to write about this, I would add the title of the pro, a bit of text about why that is good, and then I could duplicate that and start writing my pro 2 and put that in there like that. To add a con, it's exactly the same. So there's our first con, and then here I will duplicate that as well, and we'll do new con 2. Then if we go up and save this and view it on the front end, and this is what it looks like on the front end for a reader. So the first thing that we want to do here is combine these into one component and then be able to change the background color to green for the pro or red for a con, because basically these components here are exactly the same except the background color changes. So it may as well be one component if possible. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to go ahead and collapse that. And then over here, we'll open up the navigator. So this is Cwicly's version of the list view in the block editor. You want to be using this one, the navigator, if you are using Cwicly. It just works a lot better and you have extra functionality that is going to speed up your workflow. So with this done, let's go ahead and remove all of these except for one. And then let's go ahead and create our new component, which is going to be like our pro and con, but have the ability to change the background color. So I'm going to click on this component here for the pro and go modify, so we have access to the inner blocks. And I'm going to copy this and then paste that outside of the component. So now this has been isolated as its own separate thing outside of the component. And then for here, I'm going to remove the pro component. I'm going to rename this before I get, so pro con. That's just for the admin interface here for me. And then if we expand this, we can see those inner blocks there. Now on this div here, we have our rounded corners and green background, and that is actually applied using our global CSS class Pro. So if I click on this and we go through, you can see the background color is set here under layout. It's flex, and then it's display column. And then we have some margin and padding here and our rounded corners there. And if we go onto our CSS class and hover here, we can see all of those settings applied there. Now I want to take these settings here and duplicate them into a separate CSS class. So I'll go up here. I'm going to create a new global CSS class called Pro Con and press enter. And then we'll click the plus sign here to go back into our editor. And where the pro is, I'm going to go here and go copy styles. And then where the con is, I'm going to go paste styles and then command V and then exit out of that. So now if we remove this pro class, we see no change because all of those have been copied over to this class here. Now, just for this demonstration, I'm going to go for our pro con class and then go back to background. And I'm going to select a background color to be this sand color. Just so we can see when we toggle between a pro and con, we can see this background color change to green or red. So with that done, we can right click here and go create component. And we'll call this pro con and press enter. And now we have our pro con component. And if we click modify, we can see there's our div with our heading and our paragraph. So what we want to do now is with our component selected and it's being modified, over here, in the previous video, we used properties to change some settings for the component. For this one, we're going to be using styles. So here I'm going to add a style and we'll call this pro, and then we'll add another style and we'll call this con. So now if we get out of editing the component, so let's just say we've just inserted this pro con component. If we click on it, over here, we can select the style pro and con. Now nothing's going to happen because we've just registered them, but we haven't set any settings for each of them. So let's go ahead and do that now. So with our component selected, we'll go modify. So now if I click on our div here, you can see there's a drop down here that says base. And we're in the primary and component settings tab. So as we go through this, we can't select our style here. But if we go to the design, this will become active. So if I go to design, now we can choose a style. So I could go pro, and now we can set properties for that style. Under background, if we click here to choose a background color, so the light green. And then up here, we could go to con. And now we're selecting the background color for the con style. That's all we need to do here, because remember, the only thing changing here between the styles is the background color. The rounded corners, the padding, that is all set on the component itself, so the base styles. So if we swap this back to base, this is actually where we would set that, but we've set it on the global CSS class, pro-con. So if we didn't want to use a global CSS class, we could just apply those styles here for the base. But let's go ahead and get out of that component and let's see how this works from the beginning. So let's just say we come in here, we're writing a blog post. So we go components and then we add a pro con component and then we start typing. So I want this to be a pro. So by default, it is selected the first one there. So pro. So I could go, this is a pro, and then right here. And then over here, I could duplicate that and then Pro 2, write a bit of text. And you know what? It's not saving because we didn't map the properties within the component. So the last thing we need to do, click into here, we'll go modify, and then we go to the heading. Here for the content, we can click and then add a new text field. And this could be pro con heading and click connect. So now that's mapped there. And then for the paragraph, we will click on content and we're going to create a new text field here. And we'll call this pro con text and click connect. Now that's mapped there. So now that is all complete. So if we click back on our pro con component here, when we start typing, it stays there. When we start typing here, it stays there as well. If we want to create another one, we could go duplicate, and this would be Pro 2, write a bit of text there. Now, if we want to do cons, we could go up here and duplicate that. And then over here for the style, we would select con, and that changes the background color to red. And we can go con 1, write that, and then duplicate that, and con 2, and write that as well. Later on down the track, let's just say we think the rounded corners are too round, and we want to make them less round. We could click on our component and go modify, then click on the div, and then we would edit, in this case, the global CSS class. And then if we go down to design and rounded corners, this has my medium. Let's just say we don't want any rounded corners. So if I was to remove that, it removes it from every instance of that component. If I wanted to increase it, I could do something like 2XL, and now that's going to update across my entire site. So I'll just reset that to the medium. So that's part one of what Sunny said to do here, consolidate them into one using styles. So now let's move on to this second option where we're going to nest one component into another component, which is dealing with this down here, where we're going to use something called inner blocks. So to show you why this is so powerful, I want to show you where I ran into a problem where doing something like nested components is going to make my life a lot easier, and probably will for you as well. So let's go ahead and get rid of them. And then for the second one, let's just change this to a con, and I'll write con 1. So let's say I'm writing this blog post and I've wrote my pros and cons here. But if I go and look at another post that I wrote where I reviewed software, I want to list my pros here and I want to list my cons there. But I also, wherever I have that, I want to introduce it with a heading and a paragraph. So ideally, I want this to be part of the component for the pros and cons. If I go edit post, if we break down how I have this currently set up, I have a div that I created here for this particular blog post. So locally, I created a div. Inside that div, I added a heading element where I wrote pros and cons. Then I added a paragraph. And then under that, I have a pro component, and I have a couple of them, and I list out all the different pros as different components. And then I have con components here under that as well down the bottom here. Now we've consolidated them into just the one pro cons component as we've just done, but how do we go ahead and make the heading and paragraph as one component with the pros and cons as a component? Like, how do I go and insert that into my page as one component? If we could make this the component, and then inside the component, we'd have heading and paragraph, but then nest a pro and cons component inside of there that we can repeat, then that would solve the issue here. So let's go ahead and set that up. So here I'm going to right click and go wrap, and we'll go div, and I'll call this pro con, and I'm going to drag that into there. Also in here, I'm going to insert a heading, and we'll put that first. And for the heading, I'll write pros and cons. And then after that, let's insert a paragraph, which is there, and we'll put that up there. And I'll just write some dummy text for that. Because we named our component pro con, I'm just going to rename the wrapper here to pros cons. And then over here, let's create a new CSS class, pros, cons, and press enter. Now, we don't need to go and style this CSS class here, but I just think it's a good habit to add your CSS classes to the different elements. So now let's go ahead and turn this into a component and see what happens. So I will right click and go create component, and we'll call this pros and cons and press enter. So now that's its own separate component. So now let's click to our component and go modify. And then for our heading where it says pros and cons, I don't need to create a property for this component because I want this to be the same text for every instance of this component across my website. So we'll just leave that. The paragraph, that's going to change. So here, let's go ahead and go under primary component where it says content. I'll click and I'm going to add a new rich text field, and I'm going to call this pros and cons intro, and then press connect and exit out of that. And so now if we get out of modifying the component, let's just start from scratch. So we start writing a blog post, we insert the pros and cons component. There it is there. The heading comes across. We could click here and write some intro text. So that's all working. Now we can also click on this component here and we could write pro 1, and then we could write a bit of text. And here we could write this is con 1. So it looks like this is all working, but obviously we want to be able to add multiple pros and cons. And this is where the problem comes in. So even though I can click on this, if I go up to here, there's no way to duplicate the component there. And if I click on this and I go up there, we can select the parent block, which is the component. There's no way to access that component and duplicate it or repeat it. So this is where we need to do the next thing, which is to insert an inner blocks element into the component. So to do that, we'll click on our component and then we'll go modify. So let's select the wrapping div here and go right click and insert. And if you're in the habit of doing this like me, there's no inner blocks block there. So to add it, we actually need to go up to here and search for it. So search inner block, and there it is, inner blocks, and we'll click the plus sign to add it in there, and we're going to drag it into our component. Now this next bit is quite interesting, and I would definitely recommend understanding how this works. The inner blocks here, if I was to go forward and get rid of that and rid of that, and then if we get this component and drag that into our inner blocks, and then we click over to here to exit out of editing the component. So now we have our component, the parent component. Inside of the inner blocks is our other component for the specific pro. And you can see inner blocks is there. And so now to add the other component, we can just click over to here and then click there. And now it's added this component into the inner blocks inside of our parent component. So now the parent component has the two components inside. So here we can click and go pro 2, write a bit of text, and then let's do a con. So we'll click to the inner blocks. So now that's selected, and then go to components and we'll add another one in there. And then here we'll say con 1. And here it's asking us to modify the component. But if we click again, now we're inside of that component, and we could change that to con like that. So to add a con now, if we keep clicking until we have the pro con selected, then we should be able to just duplicate it, and we can also do it that way as well. But now we've managed to nest a component inside of another component by adding it into the inner blocks block. But here's the thing about what we've just done. Whatever you add inside of a component's inner blocks is only for that local instance of that component. So what I mean by that is we have this component here, and inside there the inner blocks has these other components. If I was to go to components here and add the parent block again from scratch and pull that to the first position in the navigator, so now that's up there. But notice how inside of our component, if we go modify, inside of the inner blocks, we added these inside of the inner blocks to the actual component that we just inserted. But if we go into editing this one that we just inserted and go modify, the inner blocks is empty. And that's what I mean by whatever's inside the inner blocks is local to that instance. And so when we insert it from scratch, the inner blocks is empty. And so now we got to think about, okay, so if we obviously want to be able to insert this into a page, come with a couple of these components in the inner blocks to start with, and then I would go and write my content for that product review and duplicate them as I need. How can we go about doing that? And so I'm assuming this is going to come with Cwicly later on. Cwicly released this feature a couple of weeks ago. It's definitely going to happen. But for now, this is what I'm thinking you do. So what I'm thinking is the best way to do that would be to save this component as a local pattern. So to do that, we'll go down to Appearance and then to Editor. And then here in the full site editor, let's go to Patterns and then to Manage all of my patterns and then click Add New. And this will not be synced, so we'll disable that and click Create. I'll give this the name Pros and Cons. And then here I'm going to copy. So let's go copy. And then over here I will paste and then click Publish. So back here in our blog post, let's go ahead and save this and save the post. And I'll reload the page. Now let's say this was starting from scratch. So this is a new post. Then to insert that local pattern, we go up to the plus sign and then over to Patterns and then My Patterns. And then there it is, Pros and Cons. So if we click this, now that says it's inserted, we can see it behind here. So if we get out of there, so there it is. So I would just start writing my new review. So let's just say I'm reviewing a certain web host. This hosting is so fast. Pro 1, it is affordable. Pro 2, there, Con 1, and then Con 2. Update, update. And on the front end, if we reload, we can see those changes taking effect there. Then let's go and create one more post. And let's imagine this is a review for FunnelKit. So review for FunnelKit. And now we want to add our pros and cons. So we'll go ahead and add the patterns. So over here, we'll go to Patterns and then My Patterns. And then we'll click. That's inserted it over here. And we're ready to go. And then the intro, I could write that. Pro 1, so let's just say sales funnels. And then Pro 2, build an email list. And cons, new con 1. And then my other con 2. So I just want to save and publish this and make sure that when we insert a component that was from a local pattern, that it creates the data separately. So let's go ahead and view this post. So here's the FunnelKit review, and so that is all output correctly. And then back on our initial blog post with the other instance of that component, let's reload. And the text is all about the hosting company. So just to be clear, that last bit where we took a component and then saved it as a local pattern, we only needed to do that because when you insert a component, whatever is in the inner blocks block gets removed completely. And so if we wanted to be able to insert this component into a page, but then inside the inner blocks have these other components saved there, we needed to do the local pattern. If you're a web designer or a developer or a web agency that has an overflow of work or need a hand, I am currently offering my development services for Cwicly websites. So head to my Hire Me page here to learn more about that. And also watch this video here, which is going to be about Cwicly. It's going to show you the templating and everything that you need to know to use the full site editor with Cwicly.